The following video was brought to you by Loot Crate, who have sponsored and provided free product for this video. Loot Crate is a service that delivers monthly boxes of thematic swag. For under $20 a month, you get 6 to 8 items of doodads, t-shirts, collectibles, sometimes a software code or two. Use lootcrate.com/bunnyhop and the code provided in this description for 10% off. April's theme is Quest. They're basing the goodies off of pop culture's most hard-won journeys, so what we got here is, Harry Potter socks, an Uncharted 4 poster, and this Labyrinth t-shirt. David Bowie's cool, right? The deadline to sign up for this month's crate is the 19th, so with that being said, thank you Loot Crate for sponsoring this channel, and let's get on with the show. I can't believe I did this. After spending the entire week pretty much just playing Souls games and sleeping, I made the credits roll in Dark Souls 1, 2, 3, and Bloodborne in a 7-day period. The idea struck me when I was going through Dark Souls 3 and said something along the lines of, wow, this has really great level design. At the time, that seemed like the most substantial improvement this game makes on its predecessors, which is surprising because Dark Souls 1 is known for having some of the best 3D level design in gaming, and for Dark Souls 3 to do it even better surely must be something special. But good level design is kind of an abstract concept. It's hard to readily identify, quantify, and specify what specific pieces constitute good level design. And with the Souls games always having been known to have good level design, I decided to put them under a microscope and see what I found out, clearing out all the stages plus the DLCs of every one of these games, except for Demon Souls. Because I don't have a PS3 of my own and didn't want to lose even more sleep, I could only manage to record about 4 hours of it. And god, I can't wait to come back to that game later. Disclaimer, since much of the Souls game's experience is about dealing with all the surprising traps its level designs have in store, this video may spoil the whole experience of playing these games. Starting with Dark Souls 1. Dark Souls is almost 5 years old and quickly became a classic for a lot of reasons. The one pertinent to level design was its interconnected, vertically stacked world, which on a smaller scale also presents challenges and narrative elements in a way that's radically different from most other action games out there. This may come off as pompous, but while going through it again, I decided to narrow down 3 core aspects to these levels that really demonstrate their ingenuity: their placement, their spirals, and their exposition. Souls games have enemies that are huge threats. Even the least powerful mob enemies can take a huge amount of HP away in one hit, but before and after their attacks, they're generally left wide open for an almost instant kill. Efficient play is about spotting enemies ahead of time, planning on how to exploit their weaknesses, and then acting on it. So placing enemies, pitfalls, and traps in areas that are fair and creative is really important. So important that there are entire levels where almost every combat encounter is memorable, creating situations where enemies are actually less of a threat than the ground they are standing on. I have almost every enemy placement in Anor Londo memorized. The Painting Guardians and Dragon Archers of that level in particular. They're placed to choke the player onto narrow catwalks. The Tomb of the Giants is burned into my memory too. This giant skeleton next to a cliff is meant to steal the player's view away from another skeleton hiding in its flank. And earlier we have these crawling skeletons with very horizontal flanking attacks meant to hog the narrow catwalks they're placed on, as well as a nasty frontal charge meant to exploit this area's darkness. These are all examples of where enemies, pitfalls, and traps are placed in unique ways, making for situations that players can spot fairly if they're going slow and paying attention. It makes the combat of these areas memorable, and the dastardly strategies employed by the developer beatable. Groups of enemies can be separated into smaller sizes, the bad guys' traps can be used against them, enemies can be aggroed away from their territory back into yours. And for much of the game's first half, almost every entity in these levels is just placed really well. And they're also very vertically oriented. Though there are exceptions, the majority of Souls levels use a kind of spiral tower layout, even when they don't look like it. The player's always turning, and always moving up or down. Okay, imagine this. The world map of a regular Metroidvania game is a plate of spaghetti. You got lots of narrow tubes with occasional bulges of more open space. And so the world map of Dark Souls would look more like a cup of spaghetti. Yeah. All the same elements are there, but they're vertically stacked on top of each other, which, for a Souls game, has a lot of advantages. The punishing rules of a Souls' EXP-risking gameplay means you can more quickly make it back to your retrieval if you don't have to cover a lot of horizontal space. The need for constant turning left and right, for all the blind corners the player has to go around, also gives the developers more cover to hide those enemy traps with. Spiral level designs can also feature creative alternate routes and shortcuts that give the player new nooks to explore in the same areas they've already explored, making the levels easy to map out mentally while also being a complex process to actually play through. Shortcut ladders and elevators tie that mental map together, and the whole world of Dark Souls 1 ends up elegantly forming into one coherent, imaginable place. Verticality also gives the developers more ways to create strategic overlooks for the player to be looking at what they want them to be looking at. Like how after a grueling descent down the Great Hollow, pretty much the first thing the player sees of Ash Lake is a giant-ass Hydra beast. But take one more look across the way and you see a bonfire, both of them in plain sight. And those two sightings alone are a storytelling process. They create a feeling of dread and then relief after all the previous stress of the Great Hollow earlier. And that is exposition. I'm using that word as it's defined in a GDC talk by Greg Casavin, founder of Supergiant Games. Exposition is the deliberate arrangement of a game's content in support of the game's experiential goals, which is entirely different from what's usually recognized as the game's story. The story of Resident Evil is garbage. The developers actively fought against including it. But the exposition of Resident Evil, the placement and the pacing of the puzzles and the dog windows, is brilliant and actually pretty smart. So Dark Souls has a story about fading flames and linking fires, but its experience is about feeling super great for overcoming tough challenges. In that respect, we can look at level designs as a medium for telling those kinds of experiential stories. We can look at the Undead Burg as an example of a 3-act arc. We have a dragon crashing onto our path earlier in the level, an inciting incident foreshadowing something later. Feeling out routes to the Taurus Demon is ascending action on our way to the boss swooping in from the sky, a climax to that first act, a long battle that has its own twists and turns, and then there's no bonfire right after. There's a good 3 to 4 minutes of unrequited quiet time after this boss, which is really nerve-wracking your first time through when you're holding the massive amount of souls the boss dropped. Eventually, you see no hope ahead, just enemies, and then the dragon fries you, which is an avoidable death, but probably not for the vast majority of players. Having to retrace all your progress back to that big retrieval is a disaster, it's a crisis, it's a climax. And then, after making it all the way back and looking over this bridge more carefully, you see an opening. You're looped back to the home base via a shortcut and the dragon is beaten. Not by combat, but by sneaking underneath it. You can finally relax, level up, and take a break. That's brilliant! The pacing of the first half of Dark Souls' levels is just brilliant, but things take a sour turn for the second half. When interviewed about his least favorite Souls level, Hidetaka Miyazaki said it would have to be Lost Izalith, one of the uncommon horizontal open fields where repetitive landmarking and too much open space make it hard to know where to go to arrive at Izalith proper in the first place, as well as where the optional stuff is. A better example of vast horizontal space working in a Souls game is at Darkroot Garden, where trees hide enemies, a slight rolling topography hides pitfalls as well as the player's entry point, and false items glowing in the distance lead you astray. Your first time through, it can really feel like you're lost in the woods. But Lost Izalith is a perfectly flat plain with half-finished enemies in plain sight. Them, plus the constant lava damage, forces you to rush, and you're not taught to be rushing in a Souls game. It's also far more of a horizontal A to B stretch of land than the game's usual zones. Combine that with some janky-looking enemies, and it's easy to get the impression that the team was stressed for time when they made this area, which is the same impression that a lot of Dark Souls 2's levels give. Dark Souls 2 has a radically different world design that's much closer to a traditional action game, with one thematic area tunneling you to the next by the minute. The variety of places you go to and how quickly you get there by foot feels more like a Half-Life than a Dark Souls. It's easy to forget how you got where you are because the connecting tunnels were probably impossible and you'll never need to return anyway. You can fast travel between bonfires right from the start, which was a mid-game unlock in Dark Souls 1. Oddly enough, you could also do this in Demon Souls, but with 2 long loading screens to wait through for every fast travel, it incentivized the developers to build spiral levels around each checkpoint rather than between them. DS2 levels are meant to be chewed up and thrown away every half hour before moving on to the next. New bonfires come in fast, and that's really weird for a Souls game. It was striking to me how your first stretch from Bonfire 1 of the last Bastille to Bonfire 2 is just an L. You take one turn to the left, fight through combat tunnels, and you're at Bonfire 2. Circle around a bit to unlock the boss shortcut, and this has gotta be the dumbest boss shortcut ever. Bonfire placement is so dense in this game that a lot of the tension of returning for a big retrieval is lost, even though combat design and enemy placement makes earlier fights much tougher. But despite its linearity and its lack of verticality, I think the biggest defense to this game's level design is how often it pits you against groups. Dark Souls combat is built for the one-on-ones, and while the last game did have lots of groups of enemies, you could easily fish individuals out of them with an arrow or two. But here in Dark Souls 2, a lot of those groups aggro in pairs, and they're made out of hard targets of humanoid soldiers who take a full stamina bar just to kill one. Combine that with movement and combat that has the dubious honor of feeling both slower and less precise than the first, and it's a much more demanding game. The imperfections of its systems give Dark Souls 2 a huge black mark among fans, but on some level I do feel like it gets kind of a bad rap. There's definitely some mastery put into the visual design of some levels, like Majula, the Dragon Eyrie, and especially the Shrine of Amana. I love the look, the feel, and the sound of this area, and the gameplay gimmicks they've set up too. When the lady stops singing, monster aggro range increases. You need to use your torch to gauge the depth of the water, but then it gets ruined by this nearly impassable wall of sorcerers who all notice you at once and pelt you with spells with no cover to protect you. Dark Souls 2 levels have a lot of moments like those. Gauntlets of combat where multiple enemies aggro in on you at a time, and it's an example that shows that the strength of a Souls games isn't just its combat. The real thrill of these games lies less in how well the combat plays than it does the immersion that combat's high hit values lay down. When every little bit of a level could be a huge threat, it gives the player a reason to soak up the atmosphere and story of these usually well-animated, beautifully rendered worlds. But the faster-paced, undirected, and more demanding kind of level design in Dark Souls 2 is most visible during the Giant Memories levels. These play almost like scripted action sequences, without a lot of direction steering the player on how to act them out, except deaths of trial and error. But overall, I still think the game's fine. I still think Dark Souls 2 gets a bad rap. I get why a lot of fans don't like it, but for both playthroughs I found it to be a gratifying challenge to rise up to. For the record, I'm using post-processing mods on the original 2014 PC version, so the sections with torch play kind of work as intended for me. Plus, for as many uninteresting levels that are there, it also has the gutter. And oh, do I love the gutter. They ramped up the pitch blackness of the Tomb of Giants to 11, since now your light source runs out of fuel. The player slowly feels out safe pathways to light the permanent beacons of a vertically challenging stilt village. Having players retrace microscopic bits of old progress with new lighting helps them further map out their mental image of what this place looks like, and the walks from one beacon to another aren't long enough to become tedious. Once that's done, you drop down to a combat tunnel to the boss. It's analogous to the run from the Tomb of Giants leading to Nito's Domain in Dark Souls 1, but somehow they made the atmosphere of these places even more overbearing, more terrifyingly evil than in the first game. This is probably the one chunk of Dark Souls 2 that I think was pulled off better than the corresponding chunk of Dark Souls 1. So while a lot of its levels are pretty bland, there are also a few I generally like. Remember how Darkroot Garden has those transparent forest hunters? They weren't too hard, they had nothing to gain from the transparency, they were easy to forget. The Shaded Woods, on the other hand, has them very close to invisible. There's a few feet of fog around the player and trees that scream when they get hit, but the AI of these forest guardians isn't so aggressive that it feels impossible. I relish this area. I just wish the other parts of the woods had some damn lighting, though. That kind of a lack of polish, from their texture and lighting work to their layouts to their placements, does show in most levels. Except for the ones in the DLCs. The Crown of the Sunken King and the Iron King DLC both have us spiraling up and down and up towers whose playtime will last you anywhere from 3 to 5 hours. If this was the Dark Souls 2 base game, that'd be closer to 30 minutes. If this was the Dark Souls 2 base game, these archers would have nothing stopping them from pelting you from far away. But instead, this is the DLC, where you can flip a switch and suddenly create cover. If this was the base game, there'd be a bonfire right after the first difficult stretch of Tower 1. But instead, this is the DLC, where all the way from Tower 2 you spot shortcut drops closing that gap. Shortcuts that always existed right in front of your face, you just couldn't see them from your earlier vantage point. But the third DLC really switches gears. The Crown of the Ivory King has levels maxing out their width rather than their height. We're navigating a snowy Boletarian-type palace here that chokes into very wide city roads. It's easily the least claustrophobic that Dark Souls gets. These huge avenues open up to a city vista that looks like it took a much bigger budget than the DLC usual, and it ends with a big spectacle battle of the player fighting alongside friendly AIs against an enemy horde. But despite that increase in pomp and circumstance, the DLC isn't all a fluffy scripted action sequence. It still has a quiet respect for the player's intelligence, winking and nudging at them to do a round of backtracking after thawing a blizzard that changes the look and layout of this place. It's a change in scenery that also creates new kinds of fun little creative shortcuts. I don't think it's any accident that this DLC had the studio experimenting with how wide-open city streets would work in this type of game. It's a similar use of space, albeit on a much lower level of tech, to Bloodborne. In Bloodborne, we're now spiraling around a huge city block rather than a shrine or a tower. Despite its more aggressive combat, most mob enemies are actually slow and tepid, but cleverly placed in kinds of trap formations, like in Dark Souls 1. We begin the game facing groups upon groups of enemies, but the player's wide swings and the low enemy HP makes crowd control a much less hopeless situation. And also, unlike Dark Souls, you have no shield here. Combat is extremely dodge-heavy, which forces players to do a lot of movement to the left and right, which ends up meshing really well with the game's urban setting. Yharnam's spacious avenues make sure the player has the room they need to keep circling around enemies. Of the three elements I mentioned earlier, the placement, the spiral, and the exposition, Bloodborne has great exposition in spades, though layout and placement are still top-notch. I love how now this series just has these time-saving shortcut skips in them. Shortcuts you don't have to unlock that are in front of your face all along, but hidden well enough for you not to spot your first time through. There's a ladder in Old Yharnam that shaves minutes off your time, but while panicking under heavy machine gun fire, you probably didn't notice it, even though you can easily use it while still under heavy machine gun fire. First-time players are still likely to make that thrilling dash for cover, while returning players and speedrunners can use this shortcut to just save time. It's another great example of how vertical levels give players opportunities to rediscover old areas. A switch back to the Demon Souls style of fast travel, with checkpoints immediately accessible to one another but not without too long loading screens, means levels are built around rather than between your checkpoints. The Forbidden Forest is the standout example here. It's a lengthy descent down a winding path that has you slashing past 4 shortcut gates in total. It's something that takes me an hour even to rush, and all that connects to just one checkpoint with quick access to every one of those shortcuts and a quick route to the boss. This forest has you descending a huge distance below the city, and it's amazing that they didn't manage to make this section just look like a big hole in the ground. But some clever tree cover and an unrealistically huge mill building make this deep bore look like a smooth and gentle slope, and I think that's incredible. But that's actually reason number 2 why Bloodborne is currently my favorite game of these 4. The narrative element of a Souls stage, the exposition, is taken way up to the next level here, with an abundance of painted world-style gimmicks locking up optional areas. You can't reach them until after perusing the flavor text of a few great stories. Stories like, what's behind this locked door? At the very beginning of the game, literally while spawning in, we're already setting up for a great mystery to solve. Countless hours, 4 levels, and an inquisitive peek inside an easy-to-miss cave, and suddenly we found ourselves doing detective work that connects to about 3 concurrent plot lines and to one of the largest and most gorgeous optional areas of all these games. In fact, after playing this game for like 4 to 6 times, it always amazes me how many of these levels are entirely optional. Dark Souls 1 is open-ended, but meeting the victory conditions requires you to visit almost everywhere at least once. Dark Souls 2 is mostly linear and requires you to visit almost everywhere in a much more strict order. But only 10 of Bloodborne's 18 areas are required to visit, and the choice to go off that beaten path gives more weight to the player's decisions. It's a method of gating off content that I'm a huge fan of, ensuring that players of all experience levels have options, while also keeping new players from wandering accidentally into high-level areas. But while they're almost always pretty much excellent levels, there are 2 that I feel kind of miss the mark. But the first one's presented so well that it's almost forgivable. It's the first floor of the lecture building, a series of dark, drab, square rooms without a whole lot of interesting stuff to look at in there. It's not difficult, combat with these student loan debtors isn't very hard or interesting, the most dastardly trap they set up for you is that enemies hang from the ceiling. So clever. But that's okay, because it's an optional area that you get via a weird item that some weird guy gives you a weird clue about, which means I was at the edge of my seat to see what sort of exciting stuff would happen inside. And though it does take a good long while, exciting stuff does eventually happen in there. A second floor locked away until the endgame provides some resolution to this area's mystery, while projectile enemies and a fire giant are placed across tighter spaces to make things more challenging on your way to wrap up the game. And thanks to that kind of presentation, that feeling of mystery, it almost doesn't matter that this place is made out of dark drab squares. Similarly, you can be sure that the first time I got snatched by an abductor and woke up in the unseen village, my jaw was dropping. I was out of breath and completely terrified and having one of the best gaming experiences of a lifetime. But then towards the end of the game, no matter how many times I've played it, I'm feeling a passionate cocktail of a whole lot of other emotions. I hate Murgo's Loft, and the Nightmare of Mensis in general. I like the idea of a giant Shoggoth being used as a lighthouse that deals frenzy damage. It's thematically appropriate. But frenzy damage hits too hard and is too expensive to heal to make dealing with it ever feel fair. It needed a serious nerf weeks before launch. The developers placed fast, hard-to-hit enemies that explode into faster, harder-to-hit enemies out in the open of this thing. And dealing with it all is just such a clumsy ordeal, you might as well just walk past them. You might as well just walk past these giants too. Definitely run past these frenzy ladies on the Shoggoth Bridge. Seriously, anything in this game that deals in frenzy damage is going to unleash eldritch madness upon the most steadfast of wills. The door connecting to the Shoggoth Bridge in the first place has to be dropped into from a moving elevator. And we learned how unreliable it is to drop into a door from a non-moving floor in Dark Souls 2. Keep in mind that these are just two blights on what may be my favorite game of the current generation. They're real nerdy nitpicks, and the story behind the lecture building is so fun to unravel that the boring layout of the level is almost unnoticeable. But when looking at even more optional content, you find a lot of level designs in this game that really aren't great. The Chalice dungeons are an optional, incredibly easy to miss chunk of this game that you probably should miss, and I usually do. I don't want to dwell on these areas because they're so disconnected from the rest of the game, but I really wonder what the process behind these level designs looked like. You have modular tunnel puzzle pieces snapping together in a Bethesda-esque way to form these dungeons. They're completely lacking in verticality and visual cohesion. Sharp 90-degree turns have the player landing into straightforward combat gauntlets, and without the progressive experience of unraveling an exciting narrative as you go, even one of your own, almost all of the charm of a Souls game is missing here. These feel like an afterthought, and only serve as a time sink. You don't efficiently level up from them, and most of their loot is just material to unlock more Chalice dungeons, none of which I really found fun to play through. And here's something funny. The demon ruins from Dark Souls 3 look a lot like those Chalice dungeons. I said in the very beginning of the video that I think Dark Souls 3 has some really great level design, so pardon me for segueing into this topic at its low points. The Demon Ruins run you through a similarly sharp-angled series of arched stone tunnels that almost look like a reused set of Bloodborne assets. It's easy to get lost around this visually repetitive loop, and there's no defining start to it as you can drop in from two different points, which both start at the Smoldering Lake, a swampy horizontal field where a giant ballista tower constantly fires on you. A theme I'm noticing here is that having giant towers way off in the distance shoot something at you doesn't really mesh with these games. The threats in Souls games are almost always right up in your face. They're bad guys you can slap right out of commission in a fair fight, as opposed to giant artillery shells blasting you with no hope of you firing back. Eventually, you can climb your way through the Demon Ruins and turn it off and are rewarded with not a whole lot. Just the ability to freely explore the lake without that crossbow thing firing on you, and you could reasonably clear the lake below without taking out that tower. It's troublesome, but it's doable. I know, because that's how I did it my first run, which made turning off this machine just a huge waste of time. And that also makes the Smoldering Lake and the Demon Ruins the two low points of Dark Souls 3. Compare that swamp of the Smoldering Lake to the swamp of Farron's Woods, which is probably my next least favorite area, but still marks a huge jump up in terms of simple playability. You have to permanently roll through a poison swamp because there's no way to make your character go faster, plus you're taking poison damage without any antidotes easily dropping nearby. Blighttown in Dark Souls 1 had you wading through poison water, but it had antidotes come to you all the time. They literally drop from the sky via these mosquito monsters. It's like a care package from the developers because they know. On the other hand, the Poison Swamp in Dark Souls 3 has only 2 static pickups of antidote moss that you could easily miss. but it's also multifaceted and lively. It's a dynamic area with the PvP arena seamlessly built into a single player level. I spent hours here on my first run, because like all the other areas in Dark Souls 3, besides the Smoldering Lake and the Demon Ruins, there's so much going on. There are really interesting and optional combat encounters placed outside the line of your objectives. You can consider the Watchdog's Covenant and the demon boss attached to it as a side quest. There's a dark wraith hiding somewhere out there, a cool bit with the giant archer sniping down giant crabs, and a lot of little set-piece moments bulging out of the main reason to be here, which is to make a perimeter sweep around to the 3 beacons. Levels in Dark Souls 3 work like that. You make perimeter sweeps around areas full of extra little challenges, and it represents a masterwork of the design principles established in Dark Souls 1. You spiral around cleverly placed combat encounters of cleverly placed enemies, with each one creating an interesting little story to go through. The Undead Settlement has you circling around an area full of quirky events and places, and taking an easy-to-miss turn for an alt route still makes you go across a bridge that overlooks most of them. Siegmeyer's Quest has you exploring an entirely optional new area that's surprisingly large and complex for what an isolated little bubble it is off the main path. And even then, I found a hidden tower on my second playthrough that I had totally overlooked the first time. These little optional areas, and the density of them all, feel like you're doing side quests, but within the narrative simplicity of the Souls game experience. They're seamlessly wrapped into the bigger picture, kinda like how this PvP dueling arena is seamlessly wrapped onto the combat tunnel of Upper Izalith. It's no wonder a lot of players want to fight each other here. It seems expressly designed for that purpose, but without tacking it up with out-of-place signposting. It's brilliant stuff. Dark Souls 3 is full of levels that are subtle, dense, dynamic, and very well paced. On both my first and second playthroughs, I found myself looping back to bonfires just as my healing items were running low, and bosses are conveniently placed seconds away from the nearest bonfires. But that abundance of bonfires also resurfaces a trend beginning in Dark Souls 2 that Bloodborne avoided entirely. Fast traveling from the start from a quick menu means there's nothing really stopping Dark Souls levels from turning into a horizontal combat tunnel with dead ends, besides the designer's own prudence. And for the most part, they were thankfully pretty prudent about how to maximize this game's space. I love how a hidden shortcut lets you down to the right of the catacombs to reach Bonfire 2 in a matter of seconds. I love how this ending approach to the Road of Sacrifices has an indomitable wall of harpies that you can strategically flank from the sides or by sniping far away for a much more fair fight. The alt routes here are actually useful on a strategic level for first-timers. They're not all just time-saving extras. So Dark Souls 3 does utilize its space well, but not in the hyper-compressed way that 1 did. I think I have to make a distinction, though, between level design and world design here. While Dark Souls 3 might have the best minute-to-minute level design of the series, there is a lack of interesting branches splitting away from the main path that don't really follow up on the wealth of different areas to explore that you can hit all at once, like in Dark Souls 1 and Bloodborne. It seems less likely to do weird sequence-breaking events here, I thought, during my first run, until a dastardly act for the second time suddenly threw my level 1 newcomer straight to an endgame boss. So maybe you have options. But strangely, you also have Bloodborne-style wide-open spaces again, despite going back to front-focused shield combat. If you ever feel like Dark Souls 3 is an easier game than the others, consider this. There are simply less places to fall off an edge. It's a sign that they've applied what they've learned from the previous games into what feels like a greatest hit compilation of all 4 of them. And 5, if you want to count Demon Souls. There's fan service for that one here too. But that kind of exemplifies the biggest itch I feel with Dark Souls 3. While the level design may be the best of the bunch on a technical level, it feels like some kind of creative bankruptcy might be going on artistically. I first noticed this in Bloodborne's DLC. New versions of the Duke's Archives and Blighttown keep popping up. Even then, Blighttown is a throwback to the Valley of Defilement from Demon Souls, and the Izalith dungeons of DS3 are straight-up Tower of Latria, which was a hell of a good level, but I'm realizing that maybe one of the reasons Bloodborne is my favorite of these right now is because it's also the most original. The European medieval setting of Dark Souls is eventually gonna wear thin. There simply may not be a lot more they can do with castles, cathedrals, stilt villages, and swamps, and that's why I'm eager to see what a new spin-off sequel in the vein of Bloodborne would look like. FromSoft originally billed Dark Souls 3 as the final episode of the series, but as it turns out they're not done with the series but rather with Miyazaki's heavy personal involvement with it. Which actually makes me eager to see what they're gonna do with this style of gameplay. Bloodborne showed us that taking tried and true gameplay systems and applying them to a new universe with a more unique setting can create a more exciting game overall. And honestly, I'd rather see more spin-off sequels like that than straight-up sequels with numbers attached on the end. And with the experience of making Dark Souls 2 out of the way for the supposed B-team, I can only optimistically assume that they've learned from that experience to make the next game better. After all, the DLCs were pretty good. So for whatever the next game that plays like this ends up being, I bet it'll probably have really great level design.